I believe the fence is ready, Judge.
There you go.
The fence is ready.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I talked to Mr. Ross. My two witnesses, I don't think we're gonna possibly finish by noon. Can I tell them to come back at 1:30?
Fine.
And then they can get a lunch.
That'd be fine, and it's my intention, I've got a warrant at 11:45, so we're gonna break at 11:45, and I'll give you till 1:30. So I'll give you a normal lunch break.
All right, thank you, Judge.
Okay. Yeah, that's great.
All right, thank you, guys.
Yeah.
All right, council, my intention would be is, I apologize for the tighter quarters here today, but as you know, we had our regular arraignments and other hearings that followed. Judge Feigenbaum was kind enough to cover those for me to free me up for the full day today. So I gave him the big courtroom because he needed it with all of the arraignments. So we're going to be here for the entire day.
No, that's
No objection.
All right, great.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Ross, you're good?
Yes, Your Honor. We're ready now to call Mr. Ray Bedard,
Can you spell that for me?
D-E-D-A-R-D.
Thank you.
Yes, Your Honor.
And Judge, this is their expert, which I, filed an objection, but Dahlberg and no motion limited to keep him out.
Right. So why don't I hear the testimony, and then we can decide and argue later about whether or not.
Perfectly. I just wanted to put on the record, I'm objecting to this testimony, but I'm perfectly confident you can ignore it if you later rule that it's not admissible.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give in this cause to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God?
Yes, I do. It's the office of Mark Court in a minute, Judge.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Your Honor, can I stand at the podium, or do you want me standing at the defense table? Okay, thank you.
Either place, wherever you want.
That's fine. Thank
You
you.
can even walk around a little if you like.
Thank you.
It's up to you.
Thank you. If I may proceed?
Yes.
Thank you. Sir, please state your full name and spell your last name for the court.
Roy Raymond Bedard, B-E-D-A-R-D.
And what do you currently do for a living?
I am a law enforcement trainer as a full-time occupation.
And how long have you been in school?
In school,
Yes.
all my life, I
Are you
think.
working on your PhD?
Yes,
And how far along are you?
I have one more year until I complete it.
So what is your educational level?
I have a master's degree at the moment, and I'm a second-year PhD student
In what areas?
in the area of sport exercise and performance psychology.
And why are you doing that?
It's relative to my area of interest, which is law enforcement performance under stress. And the sport and performance world contains most of the data that comes back to the way humans perform in generally acute situations in which circumstances cause them to perform in an environment that is often unsteady or unsure.
And how long is your law enforcement background? How many years?
29.
And do you also work with FDLE, Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
Yes.
Have you ever been referred to as a subject matter expert?
Yes.
If so, in what?
Use of force, defensive tactics, instructor techniques, police procedures.
And when we talk about use of force and defensive tactics, what are we essentially talking about?
So they are very similar. Use of force is somewhat the philosophy of using force in terms of some of the models and schemas that the profession accepts as appropriate responses to resistance. Defensive tactics is more the application of physical skills that comport with that philosophical model.
And what is your emphasis on studying law enforcement?
I'm sorry?
What is your emphasis when you study law enforcement?
It's almost entirely about police procedures, use of force, and defensive tactics.
Is it also, or does it have anything to do with performance under acute bouts of stress?
Yes.
And what about that do you know?
Well, I think I know quite a bit about that, but most use of force incidents do create acute circumstances in which a subject is asked or expected or trained to perform in an environment that's not what we'll call resting state.
What aspects do you essentially look at? Do you look at psychological factors?
I do.
What other factors do you look at?
Physiological factors, which would be typically arousal, psychological, be mostly anxiety. I look at the effects of anxiety and arousal on performance, on motor skills. I also look at cognitive interruptions, distortions, perceptual changes, things like that, when stress levels reach very high proportions to a given incident.
And how is the sports psychology that you're learning in your PhD relevant to police procedures and your the professional training?
It's an underlying layer of information that we need to be more aware of when we train officers to perform in a calm environment. Generally speaking, we try to introduce stress through a process we call inoculation. But what we see in a live environment when there is, for instance, the activation of the central nervous system as a result of the peripheral nervous system being aware of some danger in the environment, what we observe is oftentimes inconsistent with what we train officers to do. It's a bit like a football coach, I suppose, studying the tape and trying to understand why the play didn't get pulled off the way that it had been practiced so many times in the past.
Do you take into consideration certain stress factors in your area of expertise?
Yes.
And what do you take into consideration when it deals with stress?
I take into consideration mostly what the perception is, and the perception would be based on, without getting overly technical, on stimulus appraisal, meaning that what you're seeing in your environment, whether it is true or not, is having an effect based on your appraisal of it being a challenge or a threat. And as a result, your physiology oftentimes operates at a non-cognitive level, a subconscious level, and causes, as a survival response, certain behaviors.
In a survival response, are you familiar with flight, fight, or freeze?
Yes.
And how does that work into your understanding?
It turns out that much of our evolutionary design suggests that we are very similar to other animals who have been more long-term observed with what we'll call pre-flight strategies. And this would be, for instance, freezing is the first thing that people typically do when they sense a threat in the environment. Flight would be the second natural progression if the perception of the stimulus was that it was indeed a threat. And if there was not a reason or the ability to flee, then generally it evolves into a fight perspective from a physiological and psychological reaction.
Knowing these things as you do, let's go back and look at some of your past history. Have you ever been in the military?
No.
You said you have 29 years in police. Is it procedures, practice, or would you describe it for us?
Well, as a police officer, as a sworn police officer in the state of Florida, I was a full-time officer for 10 years. The last 19 years, I was in reserve at the City of Tallahassee Police Department. And the reason that I left full-time policing was because I started my business in 1995, what is now RRB Systems International. I developed products and I developed training, and I began to travel around the globe teaching various law enforcement, corrections, military, and security organizations areas of procedure and defensive tactics and use of force.
In defensive tactics and use of force and policies and procedures, what other training do you have other than now attempting to get your PhD degree? What other training have you had?
I've been directly involved with policy review, policy writing, served as a consultant, of course, with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement that you mentioned as a curriculum writer, somebody who sits with other subject matter experts to construct the curriculum that every law enforcement officer in the state of Florida must undergo before being licensed by the state. I am involved in teaching classes at the academy. I'm involved in giving presentations at conferences around the country and around the world. And then, of course, the corporation, as I indicated to you, has provided me significant amount of experience on the mats, actually doing hands-on instruction with officers.
What other licensing and/or certifications have you received?
I'm licensed by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Criminal Justice Standards and Training Commission as a sworn law enforcement officer. I also have mostly certifications in areas of police procedure. There's not, generally speaking, another licensing board for the kind of things that you might anticipate, like crime scene or death and injury investigation, things like that. Those are generally certification courses, of which I possess many that are outlined on my CV.
And as we travel down some of your CV, I don't wish to get into all of it, but you said that you've been a police officer since 1986, and you attended the academy. What academy did you actually attend?
At the time, it was called the Lively Law Enforcement Academy. It was it was previous to a Pollard State exam. Every region sort of did its own academy. Later in the early 90s, actually late 80s, early 90s, the state consolidated curriculum, and most of the vocational schools became schools of the state. So many of the community colleges, for instance, adopted the county schools, and the academy is now known as the Pat Thomas Law Enforcement Academy that's run by the Tallahassee Community College. Same brick and mortar area, basically same foundation and structure as when I went through.
And when you said you're also involved in force and defensive tactics, are you a trainer?
Yes.
And what's your background in that skill?
Background in training?
Yes.
My very earliest background begins in martial arts. I was a youngster that was more of an athlete and competitor. I was on the United States karate team for about 12 years. So I would say that my technical merit probably owes itself to studying defensive tactics from the perspective of its origin from the original martial arts. When you get to the use of force issues, this of course comes mostly from my experience as a police officer, working as a trainer, sharing and interacting with agencies over the last close to 30 years.
So were you teaching karate or were you teaching police procedure?
I was teaching both.
And what were you teaching in police procedure?
I taught a lot of different things. I taught police procedure most heavily in the area of how to deal with individuals who are offering resistance.
And was that in classroom settings?
Yes.
And where?
I taught all over the world. I taught on 5 continents, 300 days a year for 12 years, and since that time continued to teach all over the United States.
And those that you taught were who?
Law enforcement, correctional officers, security officers, and military.
And what policy were you teaching?
I was teaching a training program that would be consistent with their policy. So rather than teaching policy per se, I was teaching an area of policy interest. And admittedly, much of what I teach then has to go into the law enforcement agency by their own members to decide if everything that I have given them during that session would be consistent with the policy that they have laid out, or if there were some things, for instance, that they couldn't use.
Were you taught any criminal justice standards and training commission information?
Yes, most of my certificates, as I indicated to you previously, are from the CJSTC.
What does that mean?
It means that the courses are offered by the state. They're offered by the Criminal Justice Standards and Training Commission, and when you endure the requirements, whether they be hours or physical testing or whatever the case may be, then you receive a certificate of validation for passing the course. And nearly everything that I have listed on my CD, with some exceptions, are through the state.
Did you take instructor techniques classes?
Yes,
Are you an instructor?
yes,
Are you certified?
yes.
In what areas?
I'm certified to teach general law enforcement practices.
Are you also certified in defensive tactics?
I'm certified in defensive tactics and use of force.
And are you an instructor in that area as well?
Yes,
And have you taught in Daytona?
yes.
Where?
Daytona Community College several times.
And were you certified in that as well?
Yes,
So are you still actively certified?
yes,
And you still have those certifications?
yes.
And did you provide those copies to the state attorney as well?
Not sure, don't recall.
And dealing with, you said you do full-time policing, is that correct? Full-time policing?
Policing, yes.
Okay. And where in the city of Tallahassee did you do that at?
For the city of Tallahassee, I was a municipal police officer.
Have you ever testified in court?
Yes,
Have you ever been deemed to be an expert?
yes.
How many times?
I think around 13 now.
And have you ever testified on behalf of the Volusia County Sheriff's Department, here in
Yes.
this courtroom, or in this county?
Yes,
And were you deemed to be an expert at that time, testifying on behalf of the Volusia County Sheriff's Department?
it was a grand jury hearing, so the state attorney had screened me, if you will, and met with me on a particular case, and I offered testimony. It was not a judge's trial.
So were you paid by the state attorney's office to offer expert testimony in a hearing here in Volusia County?
Yes,
So do you work for defense as well as state?
yes,
So as an expert, are you utilized in both areas, defense and state?
yes,
And do you charge here today in this case?
yes.
And before the state asks you, how much you charging?
I have a day rate. My day rate for these type of hearings is $1,500 a day.
How many hours do you think you work in the expert field of testifying, police procedure, defensive tactics, those areas versus anything else that you do?
As I indicated, I'm now in school, so that takes a large part of my day. So if you don't consider that a job, and you're just looking at occupational stuff, I'd say that the majority of my time now is reviewing cases, probably rivaled by developing training programs and providing training to the degree of maybe 60-40.
And you said that you have learned and you teach use of force and defense tactics, is that right?
Yes.
And what do you actually teach when you teach use of force and defensive tactics?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. We have certain areas, like for instance, I might teach pepper spray in one class, I might teach a baton in another class, I might teach handcuffing techniques in another class, I might teach citizen encounters in another class, ground defense in another class. I might just have a use of force session. I might teach something on stress and use of force. So it's a fairly diverse niche area that on any given day I teach some component rather than full courses. Now I do teach full courses. They usually take me several weeks, and these would be the curriculum from the state of Florida. This would be the full gamut of information that includes all the things that I mentioned, as well as other techniques like escort techniques, takedowns, hobble restraints. I mean, all the things that law enforcement officers are anticipated to either carry with them or perhaps when they use in the field.
Do you have any retraining classes that you go through?
Yes,
Are they mandatory?
yes.
What are they?
There is as a police officer, there's a 40-hour mandatory rule that we have to go through 40 hours of training, but the state does not necessarily define what those 40 hours are. The law enforcement agency is the one that decides that, with some exceptions. Occasionally now and then you need something, for instance, on specifically domestic violence training, that might make up 8 hours of your training, and that would apply to every agency in the state of Florida. We might have child abuse investigations. Some of those kind of what I'll call very technical areas, the state insists that there is some time given towards them. But otherwise, the state, the municipality or the county or the state, depending on what capacity you serve as a police officer, would be subject to that 40 hours as a result of decisions within the agency.
Are you a private investigator?
Yes.
And how long have you been so?
4 years.
And do you have a certification in that?
I have a license.
And are you licensed in the state of Florida as a private investigator?
Yes.
Do you have certifications for pepper spray manufacturers?
Yes.
And why is that?
The manufacturers often, the agencies, when they adopt something like pepper spray that has many nuances that are probably best known by the manufacturer, would send an officer who is anticipated to be either using or teaching that pepper spray to learn about these nuances that perhaps only the manufacturer would know. As a result, when you're validated, once again, like a state examination, the manufacturer would provide an examination, either written or practical. And upon passing that, then the manufacturer provides you a certificate, which is the certification. Oftentimes it's scheduled for 2 years, 3 years, something like that, where they would then anticipate you would recertify, even though that doesn't always happen.
Are you a weapons expert? And if so, what do you do in that category?
Yes, so weapons, of course, would be all part of defensive tactics, everything.
What about firearms?
Yes, I'm a firearms instructor, and I testify and have been recognized as a subject matter expert in the area of use of firearms, yes.
And have you been a chairman of any committee
I have,
involving defensive tactics?
yes,
If so, with whom?
I chair the use of force and defensive tactics committee at the Tallahassee Police Department.
Do you belong to any other organizations that involve use of force, defensive tactics, or police procedures?
I do.
And where?
I have memberships that are in groups like ILEADA, the International Law Enforcement Trainers Association. I have memberships with think tanks, IACP, for instance, perhaps with Sheriff's Association, and I don't recall. These are mostly due-paying memberships that I'm membership to. I receive magazines and things like that from them.
What magazines do you receive that you review?
I look at things like Rifleman comes to my house. I have another magazine called simply Police. It deals with police procedures. These are really vocational magazines. I don't hold them to the same standard as an authoritative document like perhaps I would find at the university, but they are articles about areas of interest in my field of law enforcement.
Have you published any articles?
I have.
In what?
In what?
Yes. In
I
what
have.
magazines and what books and what documents?
I probably have to look at my CV. I have quite a few online. On, for instance, police1.com, which is the largest police resource, numerically speaking, in the world, I believe. I have several articles that I published there. I published them, I believe, an article in Police Marksman. I've had an article in the magazine that's called The Trainer, things like that.
Have you written any books or co-authored any books?
I co-authored a chapter of a book many years ago. I don't recall the name of it. It was something that I did as an academic project.
And was it published?
I believe so, yes.
Do you do policy reviews?
Yes.
In what areas?
Mostly use of force, defensive tactics, police procedure, with some superfluous areas that I think are relevant to police procedure. For instance, pursuits, canines, things like that, that also have a force element to them.
How about in other areas of arrest?
I'm
Not
sorry.
just use of force, but do you, in all areas of arrest? you
Yes,
also-
yeah. Anytime you make an arrest, anytime that you do a seizure, it falls within a use of force guideline.
Did you have any other specialties during the period of your law enforcement career?
Specialties, well, I told you about my martial arts background. That is something I still engage in regularly. I think you covered most of what it is I do on a day-to-day basis that I would claim to be an area of expertise.
And when you were on patrol as an officer, did you cover certain areas of crimes or all areas, or what crimes, if any, did you cover?
So most of my career I was what's called a field training officer, and this is a patrol officer who works all areas of crime indiscriminately. We also have the responsibility, though, of teaching new officers the nuances of a particular agency. And to clarify that, the academy prepares officers in general with a state curriculum. We all recognize that things may be done differently, for instance, in Miami or Jacksonville versus Tallahassee versus Tampa. And so each agency would create its own policy directives on how they want things done in their particular area.
Didn't know an iPad could ring. Apologize for that. Take care of that.
We have the court deputy seizure item there for a while. Get her back to it again.
That's welcome to, that's an old one. Again, I apologize for that.
No problem, thank you. May I proceed?
Yes.
And, sir, other than what you've now spoken about as far as policies and procedures, do you review policies and procedures of law enforcement agencies to help and aid them in better practice and procedures?
Yes.
And have you worked with the Volusia County Sheriff's Department on that?
No, not reviewing. I mean, I've reviewed their policies and procedures, but not in an effort to make changes in them, but
How
really just
about the Daytona Beach Police Department?
yes,
And have you worked with the Holly Hill Police Department?
perhaps, I don't know. I've spent so much time traveling the state and training, have had officers in my program. Sometimes they're very eclectic from all over the state. Chances are good I have, but I can't tell you very specifically an officer that I might have trained.
And so have you been deemed to be an expert other than in state court and federal court?
Yes.
How many times?
Oh, I collectively think it was 13 times. I don't remember how many times in the state and or federal specifically.
Your Honor, I know that it's not proper anymore, but I do it anyways, and the court can advise, but I've attended Mr. Ray Bedard as an expert in the area of police procedures, tactics, defensive procedures, in all areas that he's testified to.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. Mr. Reed, any order of the witness?
Sir, you're not a judge, correct?
No,
You're not a lawyer?
no,
You never went to law school?
no,
You didn't take a bar exam?
no,
You've never been taking courses on reading case law?
taking courses, no,
Do you have a Westlaw password?
no,
Do you have a subscription to Florida Law Weekly?
no,
Do you get recent case law sent to you on a regular basis?
yes,
You've never had courses on reading case law or any formal legal training?
legal training, no, I read them all the time, but not as a result of legal training.
And I guess I'm kind of confused. What are we, maybe I asked Mr. Ross, what are we trying to say he's an expert in on the defensive part?
I have use of force, defensive tactics. What else was it?
Policies and procedures, Your Honor, as well, for the police departments.
And
You've never read the policy and procedures of Holly Hill?
I don't know if I don't know if I did for this case. I don't think I did.
And you've never done any instructions at Holly Hill Police Department?
At this point, no. They would have come to me, for instance, if they come to me about,
As far as you're aware, you've never taught courses to Holly Hill Police Department?
no.
And when Mr. Ross asked you about Daytona Beach Police Department, you seemed like you were hesitant to answer. What have you taught Daytona Beach Police Department?
I had probably the bulk of the students in most of the classes I taught what we call defensive tactics instructor class. The bulk of them were from Daytona, and I've been there almost every year for perhaps 4 or 5 years running, with the exception of maybe the last 2 or 3 years.
And what are you teaching them at these courses?
I'm certifying them for the state of Florida as instructors in use of force defensive tactics.
And when you say use of force defensive tactics, are you talking about how to properly take someone down? Like, describe what you mean by use of force.
So use of force is a transaction. It begins with meeting an individual on the street and determining if there is authority over that person. And that begins with sort of Fourth Amendment perspective of the nuances of crime, which is it mere hunch that brings me here? Is it reasonable suspicion? Is it probable cause? And once authority is established, then we begin the process of teaching officers how to utilize that authority within the parameters of law enforcement. Things they can do, things they can't do. We then create a model of, or we have created a model that I applied in training that talks about escalation and de-escalation. In other words, if you have authority over an individual and you're trying to gain compliance from that individual, then there is a accepted theory as how best to do that so that you maintain proportionality in the encounter. The idea, of course, is to be a minimalist as a use of force and defensive tactics officer, cause as least harm as possible while still affecting an arrest. So that's the beginning of it. Then, after you create that sort of architecture of how officers interact with individuals, you would get into the defensive tactics portion, which are very specific techniques that have been analyzed, tested, reviewed, and re-reviewed on a regular basis as to what A, works, B, what's safe, and C, what is legal. And so what we would end up doing is what we call a tactical, medical, and legal review of our techniques as the state of Florida has. Those techniques would create the basket, if you will, of techniques that we teach to officers in our certification program. So a trainer would not just willy-nilly go outside and bring in a bunch of techniques from his MMA school, for instance, and say, well, these always work for me in the ring, let me teach them to you. Rather, we would stick with the techniques that are approved, some on a national basis, really. We were very similar to the way they do it in California, or Texas, or Ohio, or other states. And those would become our standard of care in terms of what the officers learned. And then, of course, we'd examine them, and from that examination, if they passed the muster of the examination, we would then certify them.
When, as far as these policies and procedures that get written, are attorneys involved?
Yes.
And as far, and you talked about, there's essentially, it sounds to me like there's two components. One, the legality of the encounter, and two, the methodology of taking it down. Would that be fair to say?
Exactly.
As far as the legality of the encounter, attorneys are involved in writing those policies and procedures, correct?
Not always. The policies and procedures would, now, I think we have to maybe define some terms and operationalize. Generally, what comes from CJSD is called rule. It's not policy. When you're talking policy, policy generally is an agency internal thing. Those are reviewed oftentimes by attorneys, but not written by them. They're signed off by the chief or the sheriff or whoever the chief executive officer of that organization would be. When you're talking about law, obviously that's not done by either attorneys or directors, that's a legislative thing. So depending on what your question is, perhaps I can give you a better answer.
I mean, what I'm getting at, I guess, is I anticipate you're going to be, they want you to testify about, you know, was the officer's actions reasonable? I mean, and my argument's going to be that that's a legal question to be left to a judge, and you know, ultimately. So, what? I'm trying to figure out what exactly are you doing? Like, you're not coming up with the law. You're not going and sifting through books and saying, let's make this policy because, you know, of the law. There's attorneys involved in that. You're teaching, after the policy and procedures have been written, you're teaching that to the officers, correct?
Right, so we have what's called an area of special knowledge in law enforcement. In other words, how do you comport with legal demands? Law enforcement officers are constantly evaluating legal demands. Every time there's a change in case law, for instance, the law enforcement agency has to figure out a way to instruct their law enforcement officers to comply with that and to comport within the parameters of that, or they have what the state refers to as high liability. And so I'm a high liability instructor. So we are interfacing, if you will, with the lawyers that you're talking about to find out how we can develop procedures that are consistent with legal parameters. And that's what I've been doing most of my life, most of my professional life. So from a procedural perspective, there are ways of doing things that are maybe majority opinion, and I use caution with that because there hasn't been a whole lot of data collection on are you using this specific technique. But groups like the IACP, for instance, groups like ILEADA that we mentioned earlier, these are organizations that often put on conferences where police trainers from around the country come together and share ideas. And I can tell you, as sort of a person that has synthesized information over the last 30 years, that there are national ways of doing things. Is it a standard? No. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of talk about developing a national standard, but at the present moment, we are still decentralized and states kind of do things their own way. But the similarities are much more profound than the differences.
And you agree most of the agencies have attorneys on staff, especially the bigger agencies, like Daytona has attorneys on staff, ECSO has attorneys on staff.
I would not agree with you with half of that, and I would agree with you on the other half. And the first half I would not agree with you is that most agencies are very small agencies and don't have attorneys on staff. Arguably, they might send something over to the city attorney, but it's not an on-staff position. It is somebody that handles the affairs of the city, for instance. The larger agencies do tend to bring in what we also refer to as legal advisors. These are lawyers that come into the agency and interface on a day-to-day basis with the chief or the sheriff and provide essentially oversight not only for the theoretical construct of law, but they do reviews of incidents that actually happen to look if they are meritorious from a lawyer's perspective. Is something that we can defend. So yes, those individuals exist, but I would say not the majority of law enforcement.
Well, let me rephrase that then. So, we talked about the larger agencies, but even the smaller agencies have some access to an attorney, whether it's a full-time attorney, it's a city attorney, it's a local attorney on retainer. Agencies have attorneys that they use to determine what the part of legality of these policies and procedures.
In Florida?
Yes, sir.
I would say probably in Florida. I think from traveling that we probably care more about that than some of the states that I've been to. But I still don't know that I can draw a conclusion that it's routine for every agency to consult a lawyer when they're developing or reviewing policy. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's certainly, at least it's not, you don't have the chief of police doing their own legal research when making these policy procedures and acting as an attorney. You have them, they reach out to attorneys as well.
I think you're mistaken. I think your paradigm is probably not quite as broad in understanding other agencies. Like, for instance, I won't even say the states, but there are states where, yes, the chief will sit down and do what he considers best practices that's completely anecdotal. That I get policies like that all the time. By the way, that's why my job is very secure. People send me things like that, and I try to give them a perspective that's at more 30,000 feet, and it's not so, if you will, incestuous. It's not coming from just inside with a group of commanders talking about how they want things done. That's what we call old policing, and I would submit to you, if we go all the way back to the 1950s, that is the way that everyone did it. It's really the way that you're talking about is very professional and very evolved and it's very modern, it's very current.
Going back to, I've heard this before about your training. A majority of your training is on-the-job training, correct, with the police officer?
Yes, I would think so.
And you, I guess, had a martial arts background from before being a police officer?
Yes.
And any police officer gets taught about reasonable doubt, probable cause, just the day-to-day legal aspects of being a police officer, correct?
Right.
Tell me say you've been a police officer for how long?
I went to the academy in '86.
So you're going on about almost 30 years, right?
Right.
what makes you more specialized in this knowledge than any officer who's been an officer for 30 years and done all the normal police training?
Well, most of the on-the-job reference that I'm talking about is specialized on-the-job training in the area of instruction, research and instruction, course development, curriculum. So most officers do not do that. Their on-the-job experience would be basically extremely anecdotal. It would be, it worked for me yesterday, I'll do it again tomorrow.
But they take those courses.
Some do, some don't. I think a lot more officers would prefer to take courses and get denied for them because of budget reasons and things like that. There's a lot of restrictions in terms of who gets to go to training. In an agency, a large agency, let's go back to that, and perhaps of, I don't know, 1,500, 2,000 officers, I think that you'll find a slim minority that actually do a lot of training.
Well, officers are required if they want to go in training, correct?
40 hours every 5 years.
And, I mean, some officers, you know, and I know we're going to be broad, but there's plenty of officers that do continual training, correct?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of bright officers in the field, yes.
Well, and I interrupted you, go back to the original question about yours training over a 30-year veteran.
I'm sorry?
You can go back to your question, the original question I asked you, and I interrupted you about what makes you more highly trained than a 30-year veteran.
Yeah, so, of course, I made a living out of being finite about issues of use of force and defensive tactics. That's my area of study. I refer to it as a niche area. It is a niche area. Law enforcement is extremely diverse. Everything from dealing with mentally ill to dealing with trauma to dealing with children to dealing with felons. I mean, it's extraordinarily diverse. My area is use of force and defensive tactics, so I've kind of carved out that section, and I focused for the last 30 years on that. Arguably, I focused for more than 30 years because I do attribute a lot of my martial arts to the defensive tactics portion, not the use of force portion.
Tell me specifically about the legal aspect of that. What makes you more qualified in the legal part? I understand, you know, as far as the takedown, the handcuffing, I assume, I mean, I don't think it's as relevant here, but I trust you that you know how to do all that. But talk about the legal part.
Yeah, I don't know if, I think qualification is something I don't decide. Somebody else decides that. But I can tell you my experience is that law enforcement, the operative word being law, is that law enforcement officers have to understand the law in order to enforce it naturally. So I have a pretty long background in understanding the law.
Well, and I understand that, but I agree law enforcement officers need to know the law. But what makes you, more so than any 30-year law officer, understand the law?
Sure. So after understanding how to read law and understand law and turning my attention towards the niche area of use of force and defensive tactics, we get into other areas like civil liability, for instance, which has obviously a different set of rules. A law enforcement instructor who's been doing it as long as I have has to care about that, especially when the instruction influences the policy or the policy influences the instruction. So understanding what is considered legal from the perspective of doing it, let's say constitutionally, let's say within the parameters of state law. I have focused on that for 30 years, and in particular in the state of Florida. And as a result of that, I think that I get hired by groups like the Daytona Community College to talk about my research, to talk about my findings, to talk about my qualified understanding.
Well, tell me about your legal training.
What have I done legally?
Well, what training have you had legally in the law aspect about reading cases? You know, anything about legal? Tell me about anything with training.
I've had several courses that I've taken. I think every course has an element of law in it. I do a lot of research in terms of structurally fitting use of force and defensive tactics into a pragmatic environment. And so some of my training is sitting with, for instance, policymakers and discussing with them. Again, it's an on-the-job training, but it's sitting and talking about policymakers about their concerns, sitting with lawyers. I've advised lawyers. FDLE has called me. Taser is a great example. Lawyers don't know what to do with Taser, so they call me, and I say, well, this is how it works. And then I have a conversation with them, and they give me their legal perspective. That's training for me. I get to understand that side of it. That's what I do all the time. And so I would say that you're right, I'm not a lawyer. I can't wave around a piece of paper or put a shingle over my door, somebody who's well-trained in law, like you might anticipate from a law student. That's not my interest. My interest is use of force and defensive tactics and how that is affected by things like law. And so that's the environment I live in.
Well, I mean, and that's what I'm getting at, is is there one legal course you've taken?
I'm not in law school. I don't know what legal course I could take.
I mean, that's kind of my point, but I mean, I think the defense is gonna ask to have you render legal conclusions, and that's my question is, what training have you done to render legal conclusions? I understand you talk to policymakers and but in this courtroom, it was based on case law and legislative law, so that's my question, is what legal training have you done?
Perhaps we can skip through some of this. I don't intend to render a legal opinion. I intend to talk about police procedures, how things are typically done. And what I want you to understand about reasonableness is that what I speak to is objective reasonableness. And objective means that there is a higher authority than the individual's personal perspective. So I'm not here to tell the jury what to think, the judge what to think, or any trier of fact what to think. That's not what I do. That would be rendering a legal opinion. I don't do that. What I do is say, this is how we do it, and I allow reasonable minds to decide whether or not, objectively speaking, the officer's conduct is consistent with the way that it's taught, the way that it's accepted, and the way that it is presented in a variety of cases, like grand juries, like internal affairs reviews, and like civil and criminal court.
Part of that, your ability to do that, you'd have to understand the law, correct?
Yes.
And so that goes back to, I guess I'll stop being that course. You haven't taken any legal courses.
Right.
All right. And you agree that every agency makes their own policies and procedures. There's not a universal one across this country.
Right.
And as far as you know, you have not read Holly Hill's their policy and procedures.
I don't think I have.
And I guess going on the broader picture, just because it's in a policy and procedure doesn't necessarily make it legal.
That's right.
You can't bring in policies and procedures presented to a court.
Right.
So I'm sure with policy and procedure, you do the best to follow the law, but it doesn't necessarily always follow the law.
Right. It becomes a bigger issue in a civil case than a criminal one.
I think at this point, I guess we're still on whether he's an expert or not. I'm done with my questions. Again, Judge, I still would argue that Daubert and my motion of limiting, those have been filed with the court. I trust the court. If you rule on it later, you can just, ignore this testimony. But with those objections in mind, I'll sit down.
Okay, well, I understand you're not waiving your objection in that regard. Let's go ahead and get the testimony.
Yes,
the
sir.
factual basis. And we can have argument and ruling on the legal issues associated with the
Yes, sir.
motion. All right, Mr. Ross, any objection to proceeding in that fashion?
No, Your Honor, only that I'd like to ask him if he had prepared a curriculum vitae and if you had provided that to the state.
I believe I provided it to you, and I think you probably provided that. I don't remember if I sent it to them directly. I usually work through. They have seen it previous to this case. In the last case, I think I talked to you about.
Can I approach the witness, Your Honor? Thank you. Mr. Bernard, I'm showing you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit R for identification. Is this okay? Thank you. And what is that document?
This is my CV.
And how many pages is it?
14.
And is that an updated CV?
No, it's not too old, but I change it all the time. I think you may have noted that I put relative university coursework at the end, and I just began a new semester, for instance. So I have new coursework that from the last semester is not updated on this. I have also taught at another conference, the Florida crime.
Just to expedient, if they want to put this in for the purpose of this year, and I don't have an objection.
I do, Your Honor.
Be received as defense one.
Thank you. Thank you. Want me to proceed?
You may.
Thank you. Mr. Bedard, talking about this case in particular, other than talking to myself, what other individuals in providing documentation and things that you needed, what other individuals have you spoken to regarding this case?
Mr. Morrison, spoke with him, visited with him on May 25th, took a site visit of the home, spoke to him just about the incident.
Did you go out to any other location besides his home?
We did.
And where'd you go?
I went to the intersection where the case originated, where the Daytona Beach Police Department first came across the maze. I also drove by the Crystal Restaurant in Holly Hills and at the intersection where Miss Mays was dropped off, pointed out.
When you say you went to the location of this incident where he was living, do you remember if that was in Flamingo,
Yes,
on Flamingo Drive, 805 South Flamingo Drive in Holly Hill?
yes,
And did you also go to 408 South Riverwood Avenue? South Ridgewood, I'm sorry.
Ridgewood, yes.
Avenue?
yes,
And did you walk around both locations?
yes,
And when you went to 805 South Flamingo Drive in Holly Hill,